Hey guys, so today we're going to be reviewing land law from the SQE Solicitor Qualification Examination, 12 functioning areas of knowledge. One of them is land law, and one of the units in there are easements. And this is the one that we're going to be focusing on in this one. My name is Nick. I'm a lawyer in training in the UK, originally from Canada. And so I do these presentations to help myself study as well as to help others learn from the content. This follows the SQE training manual and the training examination content. So if you're an SQE solicitors trying to qualify in the UK, this presentation is for you. All right, let's get started. This is land law easements. So easements, there are main principles about easements. The main principle for an easement is, what is an easement by definition? An easement is how you, it's the right of one person to use the land of another in order to benefit or to access their land in a more improved way. That's basically what an easement is. The way that I remember an easement is it simply makes it easier, okay, ease, uh, for you to access the land. Basement, okay, easier to access land. That's what it is. That's the principle. Of course, not to burden your neighbor's land unnecessarily in that concept. Okay, these concepts are derived right from the manual. So there are four core principles for an easement. Number one, for something to qualify as an easement, there must be a dominant and servitude land relationship. That means that an easement can only, there has to be a relationship between a dominant land deriving benefit from the servitude land, which holds the easement. Okay, so there has to be this relationship. There has to be this type of pairing. An easement cannot exist in gross. It means it cannot exist without reference to the dominant land. The easement exists on the servitude land. The servitude land is the land being burdened with the easement, and that has to be in connection with the dominant land. If you think about it, this makes sense. If these two things are not together, paired together, you're not going to actually get this easement relationship, because the easement by definition is benefiting the dominant land, and this easement is positioned on the servitude land. Okay. The next thing is, of course, under LPA 205, an easement, when it's created, it becomes part of the land. And so it enjoys the benefit of being part of the land, as well as the burden and the benefits that are connected to the land in accordance to LPA 205. Generally speaking, identifiable dominant tenement creates greater certainty for the seller of the land. Okay, next is the easement must accommodate the dominant tenement. Accommodating the dominant tenement means that the easement must be for the enjoyment of the dominant land. Now, under case law and under statutory law, this is actually interpreted quite specifically. The wording "must accommodate" means it has to accommodate, I would say, the business and the mode of use of the dominant tenement. So, for instance, if the dominant tenement is agriculture, it's a farmland, the easement must create access. It must be something to accommodate specifically the agriculture, the farmland, which is the dominant land. So it must be associated this way. The way it's worded here is that the right must be connected with the normal enjoyment of the dominant tenement. Okay, normal enjoyment here means the mode of use of the dominant tenement. It must be relevant to it. If no connection is there, the easement does not work. Okay, so two examples here is the right-of-way of North Cumberland in Kent. So essentially over here, they have the argument here under Bailey versus Stevens is that the dominant and the servitude tenements have to be close enough together so that that easement that's on the servitude tenement will sufficiently accommodate the dominant tenement. Okay, so the other part here is must accommodate means, like I said, it must benefit the land, not in the owner's personal capacity. So the land itself has to add to the improvement, overall benefit, and enjoyment of the land. Okay, this is land law, and easement is attached to a land, not to the owner. Easement must benefit the land itself better. What does this mean in case law? So, for instance, there's the Ellenborough Park um, case, and essentially the communal garden, because the land itself was um, uh, related to recreational purposes, a communal garden was held to be a valid easement because that increased the enjoyment of someone using the land for recreational purposes. And so the communal garden as an easement on the servitude land was in fact benefiting the dominant land, which was the recreational purposes. Flip this around. What does this mean? Well, it says canal boat business. Okay, Hill versus Tupper. Um, I believe this one. Hmm, okay, this one's also connected. I think. Okay, the right to put pleasure boats on canal was held not to be an easement because there was no connection with the ordinary use of the dominant land. Okay, that's Hill versus Tupper. The whole canal boat thing was different than the ordinary use of the land, so the canal boat couldn't be an easement on the servitude land to accommodate the dominant land. It doesn't accommodate. Okay, so that's what that word means. It must be relevant to the business or day-to-day use of the dominant land and the purpose of the dominant land. Relatively speaking, that's the rule here. Okay, the dominant and servitude tenement must not be owned by the same person or owner. So this is the concept where there has to be a principle of diversity, and this just basically means that the owner they have to be different. If they're not different, there's no point of creating a dominant servitude relationship because it's owned by the same person, right? Easement is the right of access to using someone else's land to make your life easier on your land. So there has to be a different person relationship there. Easements must be capable of forming the subject matter of the land. Okay, meaning in a different way, it must touch and concern the land. This fourth rule here, there are actually various rules that are there. Forming the subject matter of the land means that it's a more definitive way of saying what was said earlier, which is that it must be um, concerning the land itself. So over here, uh, as by definition, what does it mean? It says, as a legal interest, an easement must be capable of being granted by deed and therefore must be capable of precise definition. Okay, so this wording is also very specific because it says as a legal interest. Okay, so an easement can be a legal interest as well as an equitable interest, but because it's capable of a legal interest come first, then equitable. An easement, generally speaking, must be capable uh, of, 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 um, of a legal interest. So there needs to be precise definition. Um, this is slightly contrasted with confidence. We will explore in another chapter, in the next chapter, which is not a legal interest. But essentially, over here, because it must be capable of a legal interest, you must have precise definition. Okay, that's the first rule here. Easement must not involve any expenditure by the servant owner. Okay, so it cannot be. It's a burden on the land, but it cannot be a burden on the owner itself. If it's a burden on the owner itself, this becomes a covenant which is not enforceable under common law as a legal interest. All right. Easement must not be so extensive as to amount to a claim in joint possession. This is an important fact because an easement is to make your life easier, okay, and it's a burden on the servitude land, but it cannot also burden the owner of that land so much that they cannot end up enjoying their land because technically the easement it's making it easier for you, but it's still their land, so they have to have some enjoyable use of it. So it cannot amount to possession in any manner, and we're going to review that later. Last, the law is very cautious when it comes to a claim for a new type of negative easement. A negative easement is to basically restrict someone from doing something on their land for the purpose of making it easier for you to do something. Negative easements are kind of related to restrictive covenants. We'll review the difference in a couple slides away. Okay, so an easement must be capable of reasonably exact definition. Okay, So there must be some purpose associated with what that easement does and why it's making it easier for the dominant land to be used or to be accessed. So, for example, there can be no easement for general flow of air to a timber drying shed. This basically means that um, it's too general. The general flow of air is not precise enough to explain why someone would need access to general flow of air for drying. Okay, that's not defined enough. There's no general right to light either, but if light is defined, saying like it's a specific window or an aperture, an opening where I need light, that can be an easement because it's capable of exact definition and that it will meet the other four requirements um, of being touching concerning the land. All right. Light reaching the window must be sufficient according to the usual notions of mankind. Okay, this is related to light. Okay, and then um, this is related. Let's look. Did uh, And generally speaking, related to this concept of reasonably exact definition is the principle where the easement makes it easier for you to do something on your land, but it cannot be for enjoyment or recreational purposes. It must be some functional necessity of why you need it to achieve. Okay, it's someone else's land, and it just makes it easier because you need it to be easier for your own land. Okay, the exception to this is if the land itself is for recreational purposes, like we saw in Ellenborough Park, the case before, then it can be held. The easement itself can have a recreational uh, function to it. Okay, so easements must not involve any expenditure by the servitude owner. So this one explains itself. There cannot be a positive obligation on part of the servant tenement and the owner of that servant tenement to do something for your easement. Okay, if you grant someone right of access for you to use their driveway on the winter, okay, to access your house or something, this cannot involve the servitude owner requiring to shovel their driveway beyond reasonable just to accommodate your use of their easement. Okay, so it cannot, generally speaking, but the odd exception here is in certain cases, if it's still reasonable to maintain, can maintain. Okay, that's why it cannot be out of reason. All right. Um, Okay, so the good way to understand this requirement is there can be no implied obligation on the landowner to maintain that right of way for the dominant landowner. Okay, the servitude owner. Okay, it cannot. There's no implied obligation. There will be certain places where it is reasonable for the servitude owner. So go back to the driveway, being shuffled, requiring the shuffling in the winter time. Um, it's reasonable for them to maintain it for their own sake. All right, to shovel their driveway. Okay, even though it's servitude land, but it cannot be beyond what is necessary or reasonable. Okay. So there's no implied obligation. Okay, you're not obliged to. Okay, to do something. The owner can't be. Okay, the servitude owner. Okay, an easement must not be so extensive as to amount to joint possession. This principle here is um, again, you cannot occupy the land of another for so long such that it amounts to possession. Okay, it says joint possession here, but we're going to say that the emphasis here is on the word possession. Okay, it cannot be so, you cannot occupy the land of your neighbor, the servitude land, so much on that part that's considered an easement that you're possessing the land. Okay. Um, because when it's possession, you're taking away the servant's landowner's ability, capacity to actually use their land for their own purposes. Okay, a very good example here was in certain cases where the land is used to store something. as an easement, okay, to store an easement of storage to store something for the dominant landowner. So here it says coal. Other ones are like parking lots, okay. And the general consensus here from the law is that it cannot be so significant to remove the servitude's owner's capacity to do stuff on that land. So parking lots, coal, okay, what's reasonable? If I'm using the shed to put coal in, okay, um, if I'm using the entire shed to put the coal, this amounts to joint possession and amounts to possession because the other person can't use it. But let's say I take a couple shelves of the storage, I put 3 boxes of coal and that's it. Okay, you know what? He can still use it. I didn't remove his right to enjoy his land. That may not be viewed as joint possession. Okay. In the case of parking lots, it's very clear. It's more clear. The ruling there is let's say there are 100 parking spots. If I only use 10 of them as an easement for some of my customers for whatever reason, um, I didn't take away your right to use the rest of the 90 spaces, and that's considered fair. Now, this is under consideration of what amounts to joint possession, right? If there was a lot of traffic or this parking lot was always full, the other commercial vendor need to use all the spaces all the time, um, maybe this easement can't be granted. But again, the concept and the principle here is that um, it says here very clearly, the greater the intensity of the use claimed, the less likely the courts will be to recognize the existence of an easement. The more you use someone else's land, either permanently by time, okay, or the time used, so spatially, okay, the physical space, the, by the amount of time you use to occupy their portion of land, um, the less likely the courts will recognize that this is a legally enforceable easement, hence easement. Okay, because you're then restricting the other person's use of that land so much that it may not be an easement. And in fact, it will probably amount to a restrictive or positive covenant, which we'll review. It's related to easements, but you can view covenants as something that will actually burden the owner uh, fully when it's enforced. Hence, it's not a legally enforceable interest like easements. Okay, next, the law is very cautious on a new type of negative easements. So, a positive easement is one where it's for the benefit of the person using the easement. Okay, it's to improve their ability, occupants of the dominant land, to use their land, a right of way, a drainage, to erect a sign, even light, if it's confined, reasonable exact definition, a greenhouse or something. Um, then this is appropriate. Now, the law does not seem to be very willing to extend easements for a negative easement. A negative easement is basically a burden on um, to prevent the servant owner from doing something on the land. The reason that this is the courts are very reluctant is if it's to restrict the other person from doing something on a land, it can amount to a restrictive covenant, which then basically means you can't enforce it. It's not a legal interest. The reason of this is that when you're restricting someone from doing something on their land, sometimes that's appropriate if it's reasonable, in the sense that it's not an immense burden. But when it becomes an immense burden for the other person not to do something on their land, this is rarely recognized as a negative easement. And the reason for this is quite simple. The servitude land that you're using to make your life easier is someone else's land. And if it's making yourself easier to use, if it imposes such a big burden on the other person, well, this is not very fair anymore. That's what the other rule is also. It cannot be at the expense of the servitude owner. Another way of looking at this is to look at the concept of a negative easement, which is to restrict the owner from doing something. If you're just restricting something small, maybe that's not considered an immense burden. This negative easement is still enforceable as a legal interest, assuming all the formalities are made. But if that burden is very, very significant and substantive on the servant owner land, then it's not recognizable as a easement. Okay, and so let's have a look in this case, okay? Um, The only negative easements generally recognized at law, because most of the time it would impose an immense burden on the servant owner, are those of light, air, and support. So these are basically things where essentially it's stuff that you can generally be flexible enough with. It's not an immense burden for you. So let's have a look at what that means. Again, easement of television reception was not accepted in this particular case, and that is because on this case, the basis it would impose an immense burden on the person wishing to build on the servant's land, right? This is wouldn't work, okay? Because it cannot, right? It cannot prevent the owner, like it says here, of the servant land from enjoying the land to the full extent possible. And if negative easement is imposed that has a big burden on the servitude landowner, this would mean that they would not be able to freely carry out their legitimate development. Okay, it's not fair. All right. Okay, I wish there was a thing here with light, because there is a case where light is actually uh, recognizable, right, as a negative easement if it's well defined, but it just cannot impose an immense burden. So we're going to have to review that a different one. Perhaps it's not over here. Okay. Okay, easements for creation. So how can easements be created? There's various ways they are recognized under law. Okay, either they're recognized in the most formal sense, like a deed. Okay, it's part of a deed. When you buy a house, there's certain easements that are defined, saying that you can use your neighbor's, land for various purposes when you buy this house for whatever the reasons. Okay, to help you enjoy your house better. Maybe it's their driveway you got to use every time, or it's some drainage system. All right. But then there's also other easements that are recognized in law when it never came with the house, all right, or it was never signed on paper, but over time, because you kept using it in a way that was, and we'll look at this, recognized in plain sight that you're using it in a transparent manner, and you continue to do that, and the other owner never said anything, it will eventually become a legally easement recognized under law. And of course, equity will follow when something doesn't work out properly under the law, but nevertheless, it's still enforceable under the law. Okay, so an express grant reservation. Okay, this is where, like we said, the owner. Okay, it's the easement comes on the deed. All right, the servant owner executes a deed granting the dominant owner an easement over land owned by the servant owner. Okay, so it's formal and that's an express grant. Now, there's a difference between an express grant and a reservation. All right, an express reservation is where the seller reserves and retains rights over the land they are selling. Okay, um, the land retained becomes the dominant land, and the land sold the servant's land. Okay. So this is very, the wording is a little bit weird. An express grant has to come from the servant owner's express wish to give you permission to use part of their land for an easement. A reservation is you, um, as a dominant owner, I believe, telling the servitude owner, like, I wish um, part of the land is retained. Okay, where the seller reserves retains rights over the land they are selling. Okay. Fellow YouTube commenters could probably help me on this. Express reservation is where the seller reserves rights over the land they are selling. The land retains becomes a dominant land. The land is sold. Not really sure. Okay. Someone's gonna help me here. Express reservation, the difference. Um, Reserves rights over land they're selling, and the land retained becomes dominant owner. Let me search this right now. Okay, express reservation. Sorry, everybody. Oh my god. title reserve. Yeah. Yeah, so I think I am right. I looked. So an express reservation comes from the dominant owner himself or herself because he's reserving what like he believes should be an easement. Okay. Express grant is the other way around. The servant owner grants rights. When you think about the wording, this actually makes a lot of sense. To grant someone of something means you're giving something away. So it has to be the servitude owner giving his or her permission for the dominant owner to use part of his land as an easement. When you're express reservation, when you're reserving something, you're doing that for yourself or for others, but as part of your party, right? So if you're reserving something for you to use, it's to your advantage. In this case, who's the one benefiting from the easement? It's a dominant landowner. So the dominant landowner, if they want to use something, they will reserve it. It's an express declaration that they believe uh, there's an easement that they can use and benefit from. Okay, um, as the dominant landowner to the servant land. Okay. All right, implied by necessity. So again, as we know, okay, in law, right, it can be by express grant or express reservation, but it can also be in other ways where it's not written through a formal deed. Nevertheless, it's still a legal interest and it can be enforceable. Um, as a legal interest. So, implied by necessity. So, this applies to grants and reservations. Implied by necessity basically means you have to use it, there's no other way. And so, this will, on default, become an easement without needing to receive the formal permission of the servitude land that you have to use it. Okay, no express permission. Okay, it must be at the time in which necessity arose. So this is another way of saying that it's something that you need to use in that moment, in that time, then it becomes an easement. So, and assuming that it follows the prior rules where your use of that land as an easement doesn't take away the enjoyment from the servitude land owner. So we'll say something like this as a good example. It's a house, it's landlocked, okay? To access your house through car, you have to drive through your neighbor's driveway in order to access your house. This would be an example of an easement that's implied by necessity that at the same time follows the other four principles of the definition of an easement. Okay. However, if you were to say, I'm going to then park my car every single day on my neighbor's driveway because my house is landlocked, this, while it is by necessity, I have to do that. Um, this may not be recognized as an easement uh, uh, under law, under common law, because you're taking away the right for them to enjoy their land. You're parking on their space. That's a little too much. This amounts to possession. And we said it cannot amount to possession, right? So it still has to follow the other principles of the definition of an easement. But essentially, um, if it does follow those principles, then something can become an easement if it's required by necessity, and that is looked at case by case basis. Implied by common intention, this is actually very, very similar. Common intention is almost the same, but essentially it's where the land is conveyed for a purpose known to the grantor. Any easement over land retained by the grantor, which is essential in order for the purpose to be carried out, is implied into the grant in favor of the grantee. So this is almost the same but the slight difference is when it's implied by necessity. This is the dominant landowner saying, I have to use this driveway. Law recognizes it. You don't need to say it to anyone. That's it. Implied by common intention means that um, means essentially it's almost in good faith is what it means. If you know it's an express wish of the grantor. So this is it has the same purpose, but the definition is different. This is like here it gives a good example of the restaurant and noxious smells. Okay, but essentially, it's any time where the neighbor has imposed an expectation for their enjoyment of the land. Maybe it would interfere. Okay, it becomes a nuisance. But essentially, there is some expectation of something by the grantor, which is the servitude landowner, right? And to comply with that, as the dominant landowner, okay, then you have to do something, okay, and an easement is created under that intention. All right. So, so what else? What else? What else here? Okay, so you can see by common intention, it's the intention of the parties that essentially an easement should have been created, even if it wasn't written on the deed. It's understood it needed to have been, should have been created, because that was the intention of the parties when they entered. Whether a lease, whether it was an agreement with your neighbor, whatever it is, it was an intention. All right. Uh, as it says here, the law will readily imply the grant or reservation of such easements as they may be necessary to give effect to the common intention of the parties to the grant of real property. All right, it's the intention of the parties that creates that will arise the easement. Okay, the easement coming out of that intention, while implication by necessity is just someone requiring that to be done because they need it, because it's a landlocked land, although it may not be implied by common intention. Okay, it's a slightly different mode. This one, by necessity, you can think of it as there was a problem, okay, and the solution was an easement. All right, I couldn't access the land. I found a way going over my neighbor's land. Implied by common intention is there wasn't necessarily a problem, but we can say that out of all reasonableness, the parties intended for that to happen. All right, like we intend that there's no noxious smells will be emitted by the restaurant. You didn't tell me that I need to build a ventilation duct, but I probably will, and it will go through your land or your property because that's your intention. If you don't want noxious smells, I'm going to do something to make it go away. So common intention is a little bit, it's between the relationship between the parties. Okay, this one is by necessity. It means the other owner doesn't need to know actually that you're using that easement. You're just using it by necessity. But the common intention is they thought of it kind of a little bit. Okay, enough for this. All right. This is a very minor difference, but just so that you know. Okay, so next we're going to move on to the rule in Wielden versus Burroughs. So this only applies to the grant of an easement, okay, not a reservation. So this is when the servitude landowner is granting an easement, and they may need to follow the rule in Wielden versus Burroughs. Um, so the reason this rule exists in the first place is that there are certain easements that may not entirely follow those four principles, okay, touching concerning the land, not at the expenditure of the owner, diversity of the land, there must be two, but nevertheless, it can still be considered an easement because the purpose of an easement is to make the dominant landowner easier to use their own land. It's to make their ability to enjoy their own land better. All right. And so if that principle is met, then this can still be considered an easement if it follows all the conditions of Wielden versus Burroughs, even if it doesn't meet the exact precise definition of an easement. Hence, the rules in Wielden versus Burroughs is to convert or to recognize certain quasi easements that don't meet the exact legal definition of easement and to recognize them as a legal easement. All right, to have legal interest and be enforceable. All right, so let's have a look at what these benefits mean. This happens in particular cases. So the first is that the easement of a quasi-easement prior to existence. So it basically has to exist. Okay. Um, So in this particular case, a quasi-easement is usually an easement that will meet all the rules established before the four principles, and in Ellenborough Park, okay, that was the case that we looked at. Um, but it may not, there may not be a diversity in ownership, okay? So that one rule, like the fact that it may not have a diversity in ownership, will prevent it from being fully recognized as an easement, so it's a quasi-easement, okay? Because an actual easement needs to have two owners. However, this does exist because what's the interesting application over here? So, for instance, I own and why does wheel burden versus burden as a rule it exists in the first place? Is, for example, I own a very large portion of land, and I want to sell part of that land to other people to use, not as a lease, but as a freehold estate. Okay, I permanently sell them, even if it's a lease. Fine, okay, a lease. I allow other people to use my land. Okay, whether lease or freehold estate. Okay, and I give other people to use it. Now, before I do that, it's only me, right, owning all this land. So whatever easements that would have existed, it doesn't make sense because it's just me using it. Now, when I end up selling part of my land to other people to use, they may then need to use parts of my land as an easement. Maybe some of the land I sell is actually a landlocked, and this new owner needs to use my land to base, like a pathway or something to access their land. And this is when the concept of a quasi easement will arise. So prior to sale, it's just me owning all this land. When I sell something, I then create a dominant servitude relationship because there are now two owners of a big piece of land that prior only I owned, right? And when that does happen, a function of an easement can arise, whether by necessity, whether by common intention, or something needed to happen. Okay. Um, how can you enforce this under the eyes of the law? It has to be under this rule called Wilden versus Burroughs, because this rule arose probably because this was exactly what happened. There was a conflict. They said, by definition, there are no easements because previously I owed all this land. Now I gave some to you. So why should why is there an easement? But if I don't give you any easements, if this was a landlocked piece of land, okay, and the law didn't recognize any easements, then then you'd buy land and you'd not be able to access it. Okay, so this is the concept of quasi easement and why it exists. The way you remember this is essentially when I own a big piece of land, there's only one owner. When I sell part of the land to another person, whether a lease or whatever, uh, there becomes more than one owner. And when there is more than one owner, the concept of an easement can arise by definition. But when there's only one owner, okay, easement cannot apply. So that's exactly why it's here. All right, let's continue. So that's what it is. Now the other rules are pretty straightforward in Wilden versus Burroughs. Okay, so this is really related to the sale of land, like I mentioned, when you have one owner and then it breaks into multiple owners. Okay, um, must be continuous and apparent. So this easement has to be real. It's got to be something that must be there, right? Like a path or something like that. Like it needs to be obvious. You can't create it after the sale and say that, oh yeah, well after the sale, then I actually need to use it now, and like it wasn't there before. Okay. Um, the continuous and apparent though is something that's it's based on the precise definition of an easement. Okay, like it has to be defined, it has to be clear. So this is an easement that has to exist in a permanent form, is what continuous and apparent means. It says would be seen on inspection and which is neither transitory nor intermittent. Okay, that means that there has to be existing a permanent form. Drains, paths, a specific window, uh, a duct, a sign. It's gotta be something that will stay in that form over a duration of time. It has to have some permanency. Okay, it can't be like something that will disappear. Okay, after I buy it, because it doesn't make sense then, right? Um, so Okay, the right must be necessary to a reasonable enjoyment of land. This is the same rule in the earlier principles before for the definition of easement. It must be to the reasonable enjoyment. Okay, this is related to the accommodation rule. Okay, the servitude land must accommodate the dominant land um, in a reasonable manner. Okay, in a manner that um, that amounts to reasonable enjoyment of the dominant owner's land. Okay, so it's got to be something tied to the purpose of the land. If this is a farmland or an agricultural land, the purpose of the easement must be tied to something about farming and agriculture. Okay, if this is about accessing the land from a driveway or something like that, it's got to be tied to a real need for an owner, need to access their land, and so reasonable enjoyment. Okay, but if you say, can I use your neighbor's land because I'm building a swimming pool and I don't know, part of the pool or something has to be on your neighbor's land. That's not reasonable enjoyment. Notice the word reasonable, okay? Because that's excessive enjoyment. They say this is a luxury, okay? So enjoyment it should be interpreted as what's considered kind of the necessity. Okay, this is an older concept, like what is peaceful enjoyment? Like what is just the expectation, but nothing more than that. Okay, right? It can't be excessive or luxurious. Okay, all right. It's got to be tied to the purpose of the land, dominant land, and like a reasonable easement to help with that, whatever that purpose may be of the dominant land. Okay, it must be painless and parent. The right must be in use at the time of sale. Right, this is saying again. This is Wheeldon versus Burroughs is a rule that usually arises because of a sale of land where one piece of land that has one owner breaks up into multiple owners, right? And the rule is established because the moment it breaks up, a legitimate easement arises. Before this land breaks into multiple owners, there's only one owner. It's not a legitimate easement, it's a quasi easement. Okay, so naturally in Wheeldon versus Burroughs, to describe these types of situations, the right must be in use at the time of sale. Okay, so it must be something that's going to be basically used if you buy it, right? If this person buys it and it's like it wasn't a landlocked piece of land by the time they bought it, then maybe an easement that was previously there because it was landlocked, like you wouldn't need to use it after. So it must be at a time of sale. Okay. Um, so let me just have a look. In favor of the buyer. So this rule only applies in relation to the grant of easements in favor of the buyer. This does not access the seller on the basis that the seller has the power and control over the terms of the sales contract. Okay. Um, I think this is just like what must be at the time of sale. This must be in use. Okay? There must be something that's present in that sense. Okay. Um, okay. Section 62 LPA. This is a statutory provision in connection with easements. So this part here is basically related to the idea that um, under statutory law that the concept of an easement will pass in a sales transaction. Okay, that anytime, that this you buy a house or you buy a property, an easement is recognized to the extent that you know. Uh, is created under law, right? Under those four principles, or the easement is created by implied necessity, or in whatever means that an easement by definition can exist under the passage of property of land between the parties. For the reasons of maybe it wasn't written down, for the reasons of maybe it wasn't properly clarified in the deed. Nevertheless, easements in whatever form and shape, whether by necessity, whether by common intention, whether by deed, whether by express grant or reservation, will exist. Okay, between parties when a transaction arises. Okay, it's basically statutory law is streamlining all these rules that were created by precedent and doctrines into something that's written down, basically. Okay, so conveyance. Okay, and conveyance is in law it's the legal concept of transferring property from one owner to another, or from one party to another. So again, this is the concept here. Okay, a formal conveyance, okay, becomes a deed. Okay, if it's just a more formal way. Okay, so that's basically it. I know there's a lot of writing here. Um, Essentially, this is the same. All right, we may look at this in another video, but this is just writing down, from statutory law perspective, that easements are can be recognized. Okay, I'll have to come back to this slide. All right, so now we're looking at how an easement can be created. So all the stuff that you saw before was related to wilderness versus boroughs. It was related to implied by necessity or common intention, and it was related by express grant or expression. Now, this next part here, prescription, is the concept where so we covered, right? What did we cover before? We covered easements in the sense that it could be implied, all right? It means in that moment there should have been an easement, or in that moment I needed to use the neighbor's driveway, so that's an easement. They can't, the neighbor can't force me to not use their driveway if I have to use their driveway to get to my property, right? That's why easements have to be recognized in law. It's to say when someone else needs to use their land, when someone else needs to use your own land for them to benefit, okay, or whatever it is, when someone else needs to use your land, such that it is a easement and they're using it for the purpose of an easement, um, you can't. It doesn't amount to trespassing. It doesn't amount to any type of offense in part of the other person using your land, such that um, you know they had to use it, such that it was implied, right? Such that it was reasonable, such that they didn't force you to any expenditure to use, right? Such that it wasn't exclusive or joint possession, right? They can lawfully use your land if it's to make their life a little easier. It doesn't affect you. That's why an easement exists. That's why this previous LPA, Section 62, also exists, to recognize, like, as a neighbor, you have to allow that to happen. You can't go kick, your other person, your other neighbor friend, I guess, when they use your land for purposes of an easement, and kick them and call the cops and say, like, okay, this person's not allowed on land. Yeah, they can be on your land if it's for an easement, right? Okay, recognize an easement. So that's the purpose of that's what is there. Okay, it's kind of the concept of the idea that, hey, if someone else can do this with you, you're also free to do it with your other neighbor's land too. If it's a benefit for you. So it's like mutual collaboration, right? That's why the easement is there, right? It's to make your life easier, but it's not at the expense of someone else. So, hey, I'm using your property, but I didn't really take anything away from you when I do that. So please let me use it, because at least it's making my life a little bit easier. Okay, and so that's basically the idea. Now, prescription basically is another thing that arises for an easement to be created. Basically, when um, someone's used it for a very, very long time. Okay, it could have been something implied by necessity, right? They could have said it's something that was in common intention, but maybe, and this arises when the other person, this land is usually, the land is very, very large or something, okay? Between two neighbors, you have 10 acres of land. The other person also has 10 acres of land. And maybe they actually never knew that you were on their land, right? You never actually saw the other person's owner. You never asked for the explicit permission, or it never arose as implied common intention between the parties because they didn't even know, or it was implied by necessity. But again, it's like the other person didn't really know, right? Prescription is a concept where, okay, well, even if you didn't know I was using your land ever, but I did this for 20 years. I did this in a way where I needed to use it, maybe like to access my own land, and you never said anything about it. So even if you didn't know, okay, this is lawful for me to continue to do this if I've already done it for 20 years. And if I sell my land to someone else, I can tell the other person without going through you, okay, as a servitude land, okay, as a neighbor, that basically like, hey, I've been doing this for 20 years. I'm selling this land to you now. You can do it too. Oh yeah, my neighbor never knew about this, but I still did it, and no one said anything, and I needed to because I have to access my driveway. So you can do it too because that's benefiting, right? I have to. So that's the concept of prescription. The reason it's worded as to prescribe or as prescription is because that easement that you ended up using, the other person never knew, becomes something permanent. It's tied to the land. It's tied as a burden on the servitude land. It's understood as a benefit to you as the dominant land, even if the other person never knew, right? Your neighbor. If you've used this for 20 years, this is something you can continue to do. Okay? This is how it is. Now, there's three different types of prescriptions that basically arise, either at common law, either the doctrine of lost modern grant and the Prescription Act. They're basically different variations to basically say like how the right to use by prescription of an easement can arise. All right, so it will arise under, and of course in this case, it still has to follow the rules of continuously and as a right. This is like the other principles of an easement, right? It must be reasonable. It can't enforce too much expenditure on the other person. It must have been continuous, right? It must accommodate your own land, right? If you, how do I say? If you're, I don't know, if you're throwing garbage, okay, across your neighbor's house for 20 years, and you've done that, okay, right? That can't be an easement because it's a burden or whatever, right? Even if you've done that for 20 years. So the word exercise continuously and the other rule of as a right um, means it's got to still follow the rules of an easement, okay? Um, it still has to be reasonable in that sense. This is as of right without force, secrecy, or permission, but it's you know related. It's also follow this part as of right is related to again, the other person never knew you were doing it for 20 years, but you cannot have hid it from the other person, right? If you hid it, that's a malicious intent. That's not enforceable, right? You can't have planned this out ahead of time and deceived the other person by trying to remove their ability to know or to reasonably know that you did it, for the fear that if you continue to do it, that they would prevent you from doing it. Okay, so this is again is prescription, because remember the right of an easement by prescription only arises when you've done it continuously for 20 years. But why is it defined in this manner? It's kind of like saying, I've done it for 20 years. You've had 20 years to know that I've been doing this or not. And if for 20 years you never, gave a shit about it, I can continue doing this. But that right will only arise if I didn't deliberately prevent you from knowing, because then that's not very fair, right? It's like, oh, I know if I do this for 20 years, and if you don't know anything about it, I can keep doing it. Okay, well, since I know this is a rule, then I'm going to also prevent you from knowing by hiding my tracks every time I do it. That doesn't work, okay? This rule only, it's in favor of the person as it arises naturally, okay? Naturally, without force, naturally, without secrecy, naturally, without the other person's explicit or implicit permission. Okay. All right. That's what it is. There's a very interesting case for as a right that they've disclosed in the textbook here. And essentially, this illustrates the point very, very well. It says Coghill poured borax effluent into the corporation's sewers in the dead of night. And this did this for 20 years, basically. So they were like, oh, I did it for 20 years. Well, you know what? The other person didn't care. Well, guess what? It's considered secret, even though there was no deliberate concealment, because your intention. Why do it in dead night if you can do it in the day? Oh, well, if I do it in the day, I'll get caught. You know what I mean? That means this point here, right? As a right, naturally, this easement has to arise without force, without secrecy, without the person's implicit or explicit permission. Okay, so let's continue over here. Now, the three different types of prescriptions that will arise is prescription at common law. Okay, this is if it's been enjoyed continuously for a long, long time. Common law will recognize that once it's been used for 20 years or more, it's considered something that's been used forever. Okay, since 1189 explicitly, but it's considered equivalent to something that's been in use since 1189, almost 1,000 years ago. Okay. This is very important to say that it must be continuously used, all right, without disruption. Now, but what happens if there was a disruption? Okay, 20 years is a long time. Maybe there was one time I didn't use it. There were a couple weeks in the year I never used. Doctrine, a lost modern grant is if there is a gap in use exceeding 1 year that I never used this, and the other person can prove that I didn't use it that year, prescription under lost modern grant says, okay, I'm sorry, I've lost that, but we'll still recognize it. Okay? This would be the situation where the dominant and servant tenants have been in common ownership since 1811 since 1189, or where the user is not nixed before the action is brought. Okay, so this is just the concept where the situation, again, the common ownership thing is related to Wilson versus Burroughs, right? I sell my land, and different people buy it from me, right? And the easement is created and so forth, and whatever. It's been 20 years, or in the sense, lost modern grant basically says if there is a gap in use using 1 year, I can still retain that right. All right. This is a last resort because there's many ways that you can end up rebutting this. Okay. Prescription under the Prescription Act. So this was formally created in 1852, probably to recognize that prescription where someone used it for 20 years or more, the right of an easement naturally exists. Okay, 20 years for prescription, 30 years for profit. Profit is prendre des profits. Okay, so take something from the other person's land as a profit. Okay, and if I'm doing that for over 20 years or 30 years for profits, there's a prescriptive easement, even if it commenced after 1889. Prescription under the Prescription Act can be viewed as the codification of the principle of prescription and the codification of, I guess, the doctrine of prescription in an act to recognize this as a mechanism, okay, as a legal mechanism under statutory law that an easement can arise under this form. That's simply through the passage of time that I've continuously done this without the person knowing, all right, and I've done this consistently and continuously, okay, that this easement will arise, okay, the right of an easement will arise. Of course, I said without the person knowing, again, meaning, but not that I would have deceptively prevent them from knowing, okay? Okay, and I think that's it. Yeah, okay, guys. This is it. That was exactly 1 hour. This corresponds to land law, easements, area 12 functioning areas of law for the SQE. There was a lot of different areas here, so I would encourage you to rewatch this video as many times as you need to. Comment in the comments if there was a mistake. I could have not explained something well. So please let me know. I'm studying it for myself. But as you can see, the land law is quite tricky because there's a lot of intricacies and a lot of rules that's been developed over a very, very long period of legal history, hundreds and hundreds of years back. And sometimes those principles, because it's been developed under such a long period of time and under different eras of legal history, they can be sometimes very uh, almost confusing to interpret when you're interpreting them all at once, because some things were created 500 years ago, other things were created only 100 years ago, you know. But go through everything, all right. There's a story to each principle, and it's important that you recognize how certain principles or certain provisions or certain rules arose in connection with something else, whether it's because a prior rule that used to cover that didn't cover it so well, so a new rule also emerged to cover that new exception, um, and so forth. Okay. So that's what's important to remember. Last piece of tip I would say in terms of easements, generally speaking, is the new rule usually comes, but it doesn't override the previous rule usually for easements. Okay, it's usually there because there's a certain legal case that didn't go through properly for that easement, so they had to clarify it for some other new definition. Okay, that's just a general tip. It's just for easements, probably not for other things, but for easements, generally speaking, that's why all these instruments arose and these different common law precedents. Okay, thank you guys, and see you next time.